Ujumbe Podcast, and Ujumbe means message. And today's message is the rise of Tewodros or Tewodros II, Ethiopia's rebel emperor. Yeah, we're about to get into it. Get you something to write on, something to write with. Ethiopia in the early 19th century was a land of contradiction. Yeah, emperor still sat at the throne of Solomon in Gondar, but their crowns were a little more than ornaments in a sense. Real power laid in the hands of, say, warlords and regional princes and ambitious generals who carved the empire into fragments. This was a shattered empire, y'all. This was the era of the Zemini Mesafint, the era of princes where civil war became the language of politics. So from this age of this unity rose one man, that's Kassa, who would crown himself as Emperor Tewodros II. His reign was short, his methods was direct and brutal, but his dream of uniting an empire was nothing less than the restoration of Ethiopia, the unity of Ethiopia, the dignity of Ethiopia, right? So today we're going to take this journey. We're going to journey through the turmoil of the 19th century to the rise of Tewodros and the clash that ended with the thunder of British guns at Maqdala. All right, yeah. So yeah, we're in the book, The Ethiopians: A History by Richard Pankhurst. All right, so yeah, this is the new era. This is at the edge of the modern era, right? This is at the edge of the time frame where almost everybody kind of has an idea as to what's happening. They have an idea as far as Haile Selassie and maybe Menelik. But there was so many leaders up until this point, right? So here we go. Here's some questions. How did Zemini Mesafint or the Arab princes create the conditions that allowed Tewodros II to rise in power? Yeah. That's a good question, right? So next question, in what way did Tewodros attempt to modernize and centralize Ethiopia, and how did his reforms challenge the existing power structures? Yeah, we got to do that. We got to have that discussion. And number three, what were the causes and consequences of Tewodros the second dispute with the British government, and how did this conflict shape the events leading to the Siege of Maqdala? And number four, why is Maqdala both the symbol of Tewodros' ambition and the site of tragedy, and how does his legacy influence Ethiopia's history and national identity? And I also found out something else. And yeah, the more you learn, the more you grow. But I learned something else. Hold on, I got something. Now, so today we're going to talk about Disunity and Civil War, provincial rulers and foreign contacts, the beginnings of unification, and the legacy of civil war. Tewodros and his reform policies, Tewodros' dispute with the British government, the Battle of Maqdala, and the fall of an emperor. And I learned something else, man. This is good. So we're talking about Ethiopian Cushion Kemet on our podcast. This is Pillar 1, Ethiopia, the source and sanctuary. Of course, we have Pillar 2, Kemet, the blueprint of sacred civilization. Pillar 3, Cushion Nubia, the corridor of continuity. Number 4, hidden codes, spiritual science, symbols, and the esoteric legacy of Africa. So right now we're dealing with Pillar 1. So we're going to talk about disunity and civil war. Yep, war was the name of the game. War was the thing. Okay, and so make sure you like and subscribe, because he in chapter 8 that opens up by saying this: the 19th century dawned on a divided country in which there was, as far as many decades, no real central authority. The emperors who mostly continued to reside in Gondar, which was, of course, we talked about Gondar, the Camelot of Africa, was still theoretically endowed with supreme authority. So they was more like a figurehead. They was more symbolic rulers. In practice, however, they have been reduced to the position of puppets. Somebody else was pulling the strings. Yeah, somebody else was pulling the strings. Somebody else was in control, right? And so they were controlled, get this, by feudal lords who had become virtually independent and often fought among themselves. So he goes on to say this: the situation at the beginning of the century was described by the British traveler Henry Salt. Henry Salt, he observed that the country was suffering under all those evils that attend the inefficient government. Its monarch was in power, one ambitious subject or another received no revenue, but that allowed him by nearly independent provincial governor. So he had power. He had some kind of symbolic power, but nothing else. Okay, so this is what Richard Pankhurst is saying. And so the Zemini Mesafint had begun in the late 18th century and stressed well into the 19th century, right? And so during this time, the Solomonic emperors remained enthroned, but they were emperors only in name. They were symbolic leaders, and that was it. Real authority was fragmented. It was broken. Ethiopia was divided into rival principalities and rulers, right? And so we have groups like the Tigray, the Shor, the Yiju, Bekmender, Gajam, each ruled by their own leader. Everybody had their own thing going. And so what do you do? What do you do? How do you respond, right? When there's so many leaders, how would you handle that, right? So let me know, like and comment below. If you landed in a place of civil unrest and confusion, how would you handle it? See, the issue is sometimes we try to sanitize everything and say, well, I would have did it like this. Would you have really done it like that? Or would you have handled it the same way that some of these warlords would have handled it? It's either team me or nobody at all. Let me know. Okay, so we have civil wars raged almost constantly. Ras or Lord King fought King. Ras fought Ras. Ras, R-A-S, fought Ras. Alliances were sealed 1 month and broken the next. This is Ethiopia. This is not the Western world. Okay, this is what was happening, y'all. Gondar, once a proud capital filled with echoes of imperial majesty, became little more than a ceremonial stage where powerless emperors presided over hollow rituals. Yeah. And so the disunity came at a cost. Get this, agriculture suffered as villages were raided, and if not they were raided, it was burnt. Trade routes were disrupted because remember, the Red Sea was a major hub. It was a major trade route for not just East Africa, but for the rest of Africa. So trade routes were disrupted. Yet paradoxically, the constant wars forced a hardened warrior culture. People were actually, people were born into a situation where they knew nothing else. And so they preserved Ethiopia's independence, for no single foreign invader could exploit the chaos without being caught in a web of rivalry. So if you came in from another land or another country, get ready, you was in the spider web. Okay, who you with? Are you with the Gojam? Are you with Gondar? Were you with Tigray? Or were you with the Oromo? Who you know? So this unity came at a cost, right? And this is right before the great leaders that we know, like Menelik and them, right? The state affairs were so serious that the Ethiopian historian bemoaned that there was no one to ask, how is it that the kingdom has become contemptible to striplings and slaves? How is it that the kingdom is the laughingstock of the uncircumcised? How has such a great nation become a laughingstock of the world, basically? Yeah, how is it that the kingdom is the image of a worthless flower that the children pick in the autumn rain? So they just pick it up and just discard it. Mad disrespectful, right? So here we are. We're talking about this unity and civil war, right? And so what do you think? this is my first time hearing about so much disunity in Ethiopia. I didn't know about that, right? Foreign invaders would exploit the chaos without being caught. If you came in there, you was gonna get caught up. So we had Disunity and Civil War, right? Let me see what else he had to say. Let me see what else he had to say. Okay, because I got the book, right? Let me see here. Get this: the country formerly constituting the empire was by then divided. He makes mention, and it was divided into 3 strictly independent states. The first and most important was the northernmost Tigray, which had risen into prominence, as we've seen under Ras Maka El Shiul. Right, we discussed this before. Right, check that video out. The province controlled the trade route to the Red Sea port of Massawa, and because of its access to the coast, had long possessed the country's largest stock of firearms. So they controlled trade, and therefore they controlled the weapons. Yeah, there was the guys up north, and then later on, the empire's second major political unit, according to Salt, was the Amhara. Which lay to the west of Tigray, beyond the Tekezi River, and comprised of further provinces Bekmender, Dambiya, and Gojam. Okay, the historian says Amhara should, however, be divided into 2 virtually independent provinces. Okay, one Begender and Gojam, and then then we have Ras Ali and his group held the power at Gondar. Okay, so get this. He says if it's divided in Begmender and Gojam, Begmender, number 1, with its capital at Tabor, was under the control of Yaju Oromo dynasty. So even in Gojam, the Oromo had a little control, okay, which was, and it was, according to him, originally Muslim, but soon was Christianized, okay, founded by a chieftain named Gwangul, Gwanggul, Gwangul. It had preceded several influential rulers. And then, of course, Ras Ali Alula held power at Gondar on behalf of the Solomonic sovereign Emperor Shala Dingel, and was the first provincial ruler prior to the advent of Emperor Tewodros. All right, so it was split. Okay, it was split. So there was one major group in the north, the Tigray, and then another major group in the west. Let me see. Yes, the west, the Gojam. Okay, which could have been subdivided among Amhara and many other groups. Okay, Amhara area, like Tigray, could have considerable commercial potential, largely on account of its contacts on the rich lands to the south, source of gold, ivory, and coveted slaves. The province was also involved in foreign trade through routes to both Massawa and Sudan. Mm-hmm. And so that what was going on. There was so many splinter groups that had so much control to multiple parts of Ethiopia, right? All right, so next thing. Now we talk about the provincial rulers and foreign contacts. Yeah, the first part of the 19th century, Ethiopia, the then divided empire, began to feel the effects of the industrial revolution. Now, keep in mind, the industrial revolution in Europe was fueled by slavery in the Americas. I'm just saying. That's for free. Improvements, he goes on to say, improvements in communications, including the development of the railway and steamboat, facilitated the coming of an increasing number of European adventurers, would-be traders, diplomats, and scholars. Many of them wrote about their experiences. And so amid this turmoil, there were some improvements, right? Some of the provincial leaders rose to prominence. The Yeju dynasty, founded by Ras Ali, became kingmakers, controlling the throne by deciding which puppet emperor would reign their area. Okay, and then in Tigray, the Wube Haile Mariam wielded power with ambition of his own. So everybody wanted a piece of it. Everybody wants to maintain control of their area, and in addition to expanding into somebody else's area, right? So we have the Shoah under Haile Selassie was building a kingdom that would later rise to prominence. Then you have foreign contacts, right? That was another defining thing, defining feature of the period. The Ottomans, the Egyptians, the Europeans all had their eyes on the Horn of Africa. Why? Because it wasn't just the Horn of Africa that connected them to East Africa, but it also was a launching point to India. See what I'm saying? And so missionaries, of course, the missionaries would be there, even though the majority of Ethiopia was a Christian nation. Missionaries showed up, entered Ethiopia, carrying not only the Bible, but also weapons. That's why you got to be careful with some of these religious folk. You got to be careful with some of them. Some of them, they may have a holy of the Bible in one hand, but then they have a gun in the other. So they came with fires and political intrigue and just a lot of foolishness. Guns became symbols of power, essential for any warlord hoping to hold control of his territory. And then you have diplomats of Britain. The diplomats would come in and from Britain and France, attempted to sway Ethiopian rulers, but their interest wasn't on the people, it was on the resources, right? So instead, they saw influence in trade routes and strategic advantage over the Red Sea and the Nile Valley, because on one side you have the Red Sea, right? On the other side you have the Nile Valley. They was trying to really monopolize or take over their real estate. This interaction with foreigners planted seeds of both opportunity and conflict in Ethiopia, foreshadowing Ethiopia's future entanglement with European powers. Okay, so of course we had the railroads there. We had that, right? But guess who else? Of course, I mentioned the French. I mentioned the French people. And, the French was always there. Why? Because it was going up and down the Nile, right? The first contacts in this period between Ethiopia and the West were sparked off by Napoleon's dramatic occupation of Egypt in 1798. Yeah, this prompted the British to decide on initiating contact with the Christian empire to the south. Now, get this. They weren't even worried about Ethiopia and Sudan and all that until France got there. It's wild. It's wild. And so Lord Valentia, a British nobleman devoted to his country's imperial and commercial interests, sailed to the Red Sea in 1804, came all the way down there to have a conversation. In 1804. So he sent his secretary draftsman, Henry Salt, inland to Tigray, with instructions to investigate the possibility of in establishing British commercial ties with the territory. You know what it was. And so he got there, and then one of the people that he was in connection with, Roswalda Selassie, died in 1816, and so he had to do a reset, because Walda Selassie was quick to see the possible advantage in relations to with Britain. So he kind of bypassed Henry Salt. So he wrote directly to King George III, and on October 1805, begging the latter in terms of reminiscent to Lebna Dengel's appeal to the Portuguese 3 centuries earlier. That's why we got to be careful with who we contact and who we communicate with, because eventually they'll throw that in our face. Eventually, they would try to use that as a tool of manipulation. You got to be careful with that. And I got an issue with that. How are we, a sovereign nation, begging for their approval? You're going to see that a little bit later. Hold on. You're going to see that in a few minutes where, oh man, you'll see it in a few minutes where we need to stop that. We need to stop trying to communicate with other people, begging them for their approval or their affirmation. You are a sovereign nation. You're a sovereign people. You don't need nobody else's approval. I'm just saying. So yeah, so they wrote the Portuguese a few centuries earlier Why? Because they heard that the Portuguese was Christian, and so therefore, a few centuries later, in the 19th century, Walda Selassie decided to write the British, thinking that the British Empire would be gracious towards them. So he expressed the fear that fear for his country, fear that his country, he says, Selassie says, might not be able to supply any quantity of valuable commodities sufficient to recompense our merchants for engaging in so precious a trade, more especially as the Abyssinians were not much acquainted with commercial transactions. This is not Selassie. I'm sorry. This is not Selassie. This is a British man. A British man saying that these people don't have the capacity and knowledge to trade globally. You came all the way down here, though. You came all the way to Abyssinia. You came all the way to Habasha and say, oh, they're not as good as us. Yeah. He says, could any plan, however, be arranged for obviating these difficulties? He would most readily concur in carrying that into effect. So, yeah. Then the Ethiopian leader touched on another issue. Remember, we told you the Ottoman Empire was occupying that space, right? Yeah. He went on and discussed the Turkish occupation of the port of Massawa. So you telling folk your business. This is wild, man. You're appealing to, you're writing to one oppressor to free you from another. This is crazy. So he declared that his subjects firmly entrenched in the highlands found it difficult to gain access to the port. Why? Because the Ottomans are there, the foreigners are there, right? The latter, Latter, was then under the control of Egypt, which had acquired it in its capacity as part of the Ottoman Empire. So, of course, the Egyptians were cool with the Ottoman Empire at this time. They were not that Nile Valley culture that we used to know. They're in league with the foreigners. That's why we say again, the people that are in Egypt right now aren't the original people. Because at this time, the original people, or the people that was writing the paperwork, was cool with another group of people of the Ottoman Empire. They was not connected with the indigenous people who remember Sudan and Ethiopia like that. No. Lord Valentinian's initiative was fruitless, but had important long-term consequences. Walda Selassie's successor, the Jazmach Sabagadis Waldu, who gained control of Tigray in 1822, displayed interest in developing relations with Britain. Okay. This is wild. In 1827, he dispatched Saul's former British employee, William Coffin, to England, and with a letter to King George IV, asking for 100 cavalrymen, a carpenter, church builder who would build in your country. You're asking them for supplies and another military? Yeah. This is crazy. And so on assuming power in 1855, the next ruler of Tigray, he dispatched a messenger to Egypt in vain attempt to acquire a new emperor. So wait a minute. You write a letter to Britain wanting them to send you a military, to send you carpenters, to send you church builders. Then you turn around and send a letter to the Egyptian Coptic Church to send you a bishop to pray for y'all. I can't make this up. As divided physically Ethiopia is, Ethiopia was also mentally divided too. What do y'all think? Like and comment below. Let me know. Was Ethiopia mentally and physically divided in the 19th century? Yeah. Let me know. Emperor Shala Dengel at Gondar, in an impassioned appeal to Queen Victoria of Britain and King Louis of French, he wrote them both making appeals, hoping that they would find the kindness of their heart to help Ethiopia. And of course, later on, they followed up with more discussions with a letter asking her to help in facilitating the passage of an album. So the Ottoman Empire was not going to allow a Christian bishop basically to go to Ethiopia. So you're asking somebody else, a foreigner, to help bring this other foreign bishop down to you by escort. He appealed her help as basically from one Christian to another. He basically said, Webe says this: in former times, Masawa, as far as the sea, was in the hands of our ancestors. Then, when we quarreled amongst ourselves, the Turks struck and took it by force. Yeah. Following this, 2 years ago, they sent an army, seized Minkilu and Dahono Bar, two localities in the mainland. The letter, he sent an appeal saying, "Hey, the Turks, if you are a Christian nation, the Islamic group has occupied this space." The letter went to recall that Niyab, or local ruler of Arikiko, had 2 years earlier ceased paying his customary tribute. See, say, hey, then not only the Turks occupying this space, ain't nobody paying money. Yeah. But get this, after all that back and forth, after all that writing and whatnot, the British was no longer interested. They were no longer interested in Ethiopia. They wanted Egypt. Yeah, so they ignored those letters. Yeah, they was more interested in Egypt, which was then being modernized by his great ruler Muhammad Ali, than in a far-off, economically backward Ethiopia. He therefore refused. The British Foreign Secretary refused to listen to Weeby's appeal. Instead, he replied that Queen Victoria would gladly do anything for the Ras, but bluntly added that the Sultan of Turkey was also a friend to the Queen. Yeah. So they were stuck. And of course there was a lot of letters going back and forth, and in response, later on to this initiative, the British and later the French sent diplomatic missions to Sawa and concluded treaties with the king in November 18th, 1841. And so they basically said, fine, we'll give you a treaty, fine, whatever. It wasn't for real. They just put that on paper. Yeah. He wrote to Queen Victoria in 1852, begging her to support the Ethiopian Christians. He wrote that. Instead of just standing on your own two, say, "No, fine. We good." Yeah. Interest in Western contacts, particularly after the British occupation of Aden in 1839, had meanwhile also been voiced further south by King Haile Selassie of Shawa. So the following dispatched a letter to the British East India Company to Bombay asking for assistance. So they spent from the early 1800s all the way up into the 1850s begging European nations to help them. That's the reason why Tewodros came in. Y'all doing too much begging, bro. Yeah. That's what was happening. Because up until that point, they were ignoring them. Right? So get this. Now, the British and the French didn't care who was there. They wanted to occupy this space here. Okay, this is the 19th century Ethiopia, right? You see how fragmented it is. Okay, they wanted this area here. That's what they wanted, because the Tigray, of course, had the north part, right, which connected them to the Red Sea, and of course Amhara was cool with Sudan, and of course we had the Oromo at the south. The French and the British didn't care who was there. They just wanted this space here. Why? Because this space equals money. Meanwhile, people up here begging them for help. Yes, we know each nation is divided, but if you're asking a foreigner who does not understand you or your culture for some help, that's a setup. It's a setup. So, but yeah, so far, if you want to learn more about Ethiopian, Kush, and Kemet, like and subscribe. See what I'm saying? So we can all learn together. So if you want to learn more about Ethiopia, if you want to learn more about Kemet and Kush, subscribe. Let's get it. Now, so Disunity, Civil War. Now we're going to get into, we dealt with the provincial rulers and foreign contacts, and now we're going to get into the beginnings of unification and legacy of civil war. Get this. I learned something else. There's something else that happened. After the Battle of Maqdala. So got Tewodros and his reform policies, his dispute with the British government, okay, and the Battle of Maqdala and the fallen emperor. And there's something else I found out. Now, so let me see, get to the beginning. Now, what happened is Ethiopia, by the middle of the 19th century, had long been suffering, and as we have seen from the Disunity and Civil War, this was more than serious in that the Industrial Revolution was then well underway in Europe and was beginning even in Egypt. And remember that Egypt started to modernize. They started to get the railroads. They started to get everything. So even amid fragmentation, the memory of unity endured. Ethiopia's people still saw themselves as heirs of the Solomonic line. Okay, guardians of the ancient Christian kingdom. The dream of reunification never died. It didn't. Okay, it lingered. It lingered in songs and in liturgy. Okay, the civil wars left scars though. Okay, entire provinces was depopulated. Nobles grew accustomed to defying central authority, and mistrust became the coin of politics. But paradoxically, this cycle of chaos prepared the ground for one unifier. For when the right leader emerged, one strong enough to impose order inside Ethiopia and outside, there was widespread fatigue of war and longing peace. They wanted peace, but they didn't know how to do it. Okay, and that leader was Kassa Hailu. Okay, all right. So now, Ethiopia, before Kassa Hailu came up, Ethiopia was torn by civil war, deprived of access to the sea, and was by contrast in no position to embark on any policy of modernization. The country was in fact technologically falling relatively backwards. It was backwards. Its national integrity was moreover increasingly threatened, for the Egyptians were encroaching on the northern and eastern frontiers. In the second half of the 19th century, nevertheless, witnessed country's first significant attempts of unification and modernization, but also major unprecedented intrusions by foreign powers. This period, which marked another great turning point in Ethiopian history, may conveniently be divided into the reigns of three principal rulers. Okay, there's three rulers that began to unify a divided Ethiopia. Okay, we have Tewodros, Johannes, and Menelik. Those three, the Trinity, basically like the Trinity of Ethiopia. Though very different, they had different personalities, facing different situations, different problems. and even different enemies, they were each involved with the same three basic concerns: reunifying Ethiopia and preserving its independence, and third, the increasingly necessary adoption of modern institutions. One more time, even though all three, Johannes, Menelik, and Tewodros, were all different personalities, different backgrounds, different issues, but they was united under three. They focused on three different things, or three of the same things: reunification of Ethiopia, preserving the independence, and bringing it into the modern era. Yeah. And so then we have Tewodros. Okay, he was born in the early 19th century. Kassa rose not from, say, an established dynasty, but from humble origins or humble beginnings, right? Through determination, brilliance in battle, and a vision of a united Ethiopia, he served his path from obscurity to an emperor, to a leader. When he crowned himself Tewodros in 1855, he proclaimed that this was the dawn of a new era. Okay? And so get this. Tewodros and his policies and his reform policies, okay? See, he wasn't just content at being a leader. He wasn't content at just being another warlord. He believed that he had a mission to restore Ethiopia to its ancient glory. His reforms were bold and often ruthless. Okay, he had to break the power of hereditary nobles who was dominating during the Zemini Massacre. Okay, instead, he appointed officials loyal to him. He had to build his own camp. He had to start from zero, right? Shifting authority away from traditional families into what he was comfortable with, right? This was a radical move. This was unheard of in society. So where lineage and heritage was everything. So he attempted some reforms. He attempted land reforms aiming to ensure the state had direct access to resources. He leaned heavily on the Ethiopian Orthodox Hailu Church. And so by him coming to the scene, this marked the dawn of a new era, an important era of Ethiopian history. Most of his attempted reforms were never achieved, but were nonetheless significant. For they seem almost to have charted the course to be taken in the reins of the people that followed, right? So he used the church, portraying himself as a chosen restorer of divine order, but his reforms also angered a lot of elite people. He angered the elites he governed. Resistance grew as lords resented his efforts to dismantle their privileges. He was seen as the Ethiopian Robin Hood, right? Who gave back what he looted. His courage won him the loyalty of his followers. He had the people, all right, and that enabled him to gain control of Quara, a Qwara, Quara, and assume the title of Dajazmach, okay, Dajazmach, Dajazmach. Okay, Empress Manan Liban, the mother of Ras Ali Alua, the ruler of Begmender, dispatched an expedition against him, but he easily defeated it. Yeah, Ali thereupon recognized him as governor of Quara, and Manan arranged for him to marry her granddaughter in 1847. Okay, so we're going to get to the one Sudan in a minute. But he attempted land reforms. His passion for modernization extended even to crafts and industry. He encouraged blacksmithing, gun making, and local innovation. He also commissioned the casting of a massive cannon, Sebastopol of Gaffa, the marvel of ambition, if not practicality. Yet the heavy-handed style often alienated the same artisans and peasants he wanted to uplift. Okay, but now there was a war in Sudan. Yeah. In the following year, after 1847, okay, in the following year, Kassa advanced into Sudan as far as the Barki, where the Egyptians had erected a fort. He went to Sudan for one reason. He wanted to attack the Egyptians. Yeah. But his soldiers suffered heavy casualties and were routed. The engagement was noteworthy, for it convinced him, according to the British traveler Henry Dufton, that the primitive mode of warfare of his country would have to be superseded by a more modern one if he were ever to accomplish the splendid designs of his ambition. That war taught him a lesson. Okay, the Egyptians had some guns that had a different artillery situation. He learned that in order to bring Ethiopia into the modern era, the weapons had to be modernized. Yeah, that was a war in Sudan. He was really coming after him. Okay, so meanwhile, Weby, who claimed the imperial crown in Ethiopia, was then planning to march to Gondar. Okay, because get this, by 1854, Kassa made himself the master of the entire northwest of the empire, including Amhara and the old capital of Gondar. So yeah, he may not have let me give you that. Let me see. He may not have had control over Sudan, but he had the northern part of control. So Weby claimed the imperial crown, and he planned to march to Gondar, where the newly arrived Coptic metropolitan Abu Naselma was supposed to crown him as emperor. So Weby left his spot, went up north, okay, to Gondar, to be crowned as emperor. Kassa, however, defeated and captured the would-be monarch at the Battle of Darasagi, south of the Takazi River. Yeah. So you weren't gonna be crowned here. You weren't gonna win that, right? So yeah, so he went. So Weby went up there to Gondar thinking he was going to be crowned. Kassa said, "No, you're not." The victorious chief was accordingly crowned 3 days later, on February 11th, 1855, as Emperor Tewodros. Okay, the name was significant as an old messianic legend prophesied that a monarch called Tewodros will one day appear, rule justly, wipe out Islam, and capture Jerusalem. In the following year, Tewodros marched to Shawa, the first Ethiopian monarch to do so since Iyasu I undertook a brief expedition to the province a century and a half earlier. There, Tewodros captured Menelik, the heir to the Shawan throne, whose father, his name was Hailu Malakut, had died shortly thereafter. He was on a warpath, and he wasn't playing with him. He came up there to not only occupy space, but to remove any opposition that was in his way. Yeah. But now, despite his early victories, Tewodros throughout his reign, he had a good military. He had a military mind, but the military wasn't really strong enough. His power base in the northwest of the empire was far from the sea, so he was therefore unable to obtain firearms through the Red Sea or the Gulf of Aden port. So he needed those weapons. But nevertheless, notwithstanding the military weakness, Tewodros showed himself as a remarkable ruler, and that was what Ethiopia needed. This is evidenced in reports by British consul Plowden, which because of their bearing on important events soon to unfold, deserve quoting in detail. Okay, Plowden he goes on to say that Tewodros' coronation, he observed that the king, who was capable of great things, good or evil, considered himself a destined monarch. He was capable of great things, good and evil. Yeah. And this fam, this is the sign and seal of Emperor Tewodros II. Okay, look at the line of Judah, the root of David, and notice he used both Ge'ez language and Arabic. Okay, he used two languages, showing that he was unifying both languages, both nations there. Okay, and so, and of course, a historian says, when aroused, his wrath is terrible, and all tremble, but at all moments he possessed a perfect self-command. He was a strong leader, but he had control. Yeah. And so his goal was to modernize the military. If he's going to modernize Ethiopia, he had to modernize the military. But now, here we go. He declared Ethiopia. He declared this: Ethiopia has but one king, one God, and one church. This shows his effort to crush the fragmented rule of nobles and create a unified, centralized state, right? And so he abolished many local tolls and taxes imposed on by provincial lords, okay, and attempting to standardize revenue collection under one crown. So the money was going to be divided, split in multiple ways, basically. Okay, but now, do you think this was enough? Do you think this was enough to financially unify the tolls and taxes? Like and comment below. But he wasn't just a conqueror or a man of war, but he was also a reformer, a leader with a vision to modernize Ethiopia and breaking the endless cycle of feudal division. His reign, though short and turbulent, planted seeds that would echo through Ethiopian history. And remember, he said Ethiopia has but one king, one God, and one church. So the European missionary is going to be out of luck. So get this. He wanted to end hereditary privilege and weaken the power of the nobility. He redistributed land seized from rebellious nobles to loyal leaders and civilians. That's what he did. Now, he did some other things, okay? There were some social reforms, okay? There was some social and legal reforms. Tewodros sought to end the hereditary privilege, but he also ordered the codification and stricter application of the Fetah Nagast, the Ethiopian law code, trying to enforce a greater order of justice. They wrote it, so the book should be good for something, not just something to put on your shelf. Once again, he ordered the codification and stricter application of the Fetah Nagast, the law of the kings. Then, on when it came down to religion, when it came down to the church, he wanted to discipline the Ethiopian Orthodox Hailu Church, which had become deeply entangled with feudal politics. Okay, he reduced the power of the great monasteries and sought to regulate the number of clergy supported by church lands. Yeah. So once again, he said this: there was too many priests eating the food of the poor farmer. Okay, this reflected his frustration with the bloated church hierarchy. Okay, then get this. Then he goes into reorganizing the military. So he goes on to military reform and reorganization. Right now, I think perhaps his greatest strength was him being a military leader, him being a soldier. He reorganized the Ethiopian army, centralized the command under his authority, unlike previous emperors who relied on semi-independent nobles. Tewodros sought to build a standing army loyal only to him. He embraced firearms with zeal, of course. He needed new weapons, right? Producing them locally and stockpiling weaponry. He was not just relying on, say, imports, but he wanted them to make their own weapons, right? His charisma as a commander inspired loyalty among his soldiers. Battles that once seemed endless stalemates turned into decisive victories under his leadership. But his military reforms also drained resources and created some enemies. You know, the way whenever there's some change, there is some issues, right? Nobles saw their private armies diminish while peasants felt the weight of taxation. Okay, the emperor wanted a modern disciplined force, but in doing so, he deepened the resistance from Ethiopia's traditional power structures. The emperor dreamed of creating a standing disciplined army instead of relying on feudal levies. He tried to introduce firearms production by setting up foundries and workshops with foreign artisans, of course, like German missionary Samuel Gobat, right? Struggling to gain control over the empire. He was preoccupied with military matters. Though a man of war, he was not unaware of the suffering caused by the country's unpaid soldiers. Besides being inefficient, they were a social bane, for they ravaged the peasantry in search for food. So he was determined to replace such soldiery by a modern type army that would live on rations or pay provided by the state, instead of them pillaging and taking things from other people. This great reform, as Plowden called it, would have enabled the country's inhabitants almost for the first time in their history. Okay, the reforming monarch, however, found it virtually impossible to establish such an army, for he lacked the resources. He didn't have the resources, y'all. He wanted to build a military, he wanted to build a strong army, he had great aspirations, but the resources wasn't there yet, right? It wasn't there yet. Okay, so he did call foreign craftsmen to his aid, though always been keen to purchase firearms whenever he could. He found it virtually impossible to procure artillery. Such heavy weapons could scarcely be smuggled into the country through rugged country under hostile territory. So he bluntly requested his European guests to help him by manufacturing cannons and mortars. These missionaries, quote unquote missionaries, who constituted the largest number of the Guffa craftsmen, were entirely unskilled in this field. So why are you here for if you can't help, right? So, but the few craftsmen he found, they was able to put some things together. They was able to build some artillery, okay, and also transportation. All right. So Tewodros, though primarily interested in matters of military, also envisioned reforms in other fields, okay, such as, of course, such as technology and industry. Okay, he attempted to import modern technology, of course, in small, be it large or small scale, and he tried to make it happen. He tried to make he tried to make changes whenever he could. Okay, now dealing with that, because he was becoming this empire. Okay. Because he was being known and respected, historians like Harold Marcus called Tewodros' reform a blueprint for modern Ethiopia, even though most of his ideas failed due to resistance from nobles and lack of resources. He was still the blueprint. Baru's Zeldi emphasizes that while his reign ended in tragedy, he laid the intellectual and political foundation for later unifiers such as Menelik II. Historians describe him as a great leader, okay? And so, but now, as he was becoming respected and renowned, right? Then we have an issue. Tewodros has disputes with the British Empire, with the British government. This is where things start to unravel. This is where things start to unfold. Okay, in 1862, he sent a series of letters to Queen Victoria requesting expert craftsmen, teachers, and military advisors. He understood that Ethiopia could not remain isolated in the age of expanding empires. So the emperor sought to modernize his country, strengthen his army, and develop infrastructure. And he recognized that European knowledge, technology, and skill could help him. Just like a lot of his predecessors, he sent letters to Europe. The emperor's pioneering attempts at unification and modernization were too soon overshadowed and ultimately brought to naught by a serious dispute with the British government. The emperor had originally been on excellent terms with the Englishmen, like the two Englishmen, John Bell, whom he had appointed court chamberlain, and British consul Plowden, whom he treated as an advisor. Both were killed in 1860. Okay, Plowden and his successor, Duncan Cameron, had both pressed Tewodros to renew the treaty with Britain earlier concluded with Ras Ali, but the emperor, despite his pro-British feelings, apparently he didn't like it. He saw the danger of European colonialism. Then, in his infancy, he seemed to have feared that the advent of a British consul flying a British flag might infringe on Ethiopian sovereignty. Tewodros accordingly wrote two almost identical letters to Queen Victoria and Napoleon III of France in 1862. Okay, and so in his letter to Victoria, he handed it to Duncan Cameron. Tewodros recalled that Plowden and Bell had told him that this was a great Christian queen who loved Christians, and they could establish a friendship with her. Now, the letter, man, he said he declared that the Turks on the coast denied him passage by the sea, okay, was therefore unable to dispatch the ambassador he wished to send to England. So he was trying to send some people out there, but the Turks was keeping folk in. So this letter was couched. It will be perceived in terms of Christian religious fervor, akin to that of the medieval Ethiopian European crusaders, who only a few centuries earlier would have received it with utmost enthusiasm, even though the the Ethiopians keep the crusaders out too, right? But he gave the letter. Okay, there was two letters sent. This was a problem. Okay, fam, this was a problem. The Ethiopians was putting their trust in a so-called Christian nation that wanted nothing to do with them. Okay, and so he sent the letters to the UK, thinking that they were going to be, as a sovereign nation, they was going to be kind of respectful and receive them, but they didn't. As time passed, his letter remained unanswered. Okay, and so he felt slighted. Okay, he felt slighted. Not long afterwards, the emperor learned that Harry Stern, a bigoted London-based Protestant missionary, had written a book, Wanderings Among the Flashes, which contained unfavorable remarks about the emperor, which included statements that his mother was so impoverished that she had been reduced to selling koso, the traditional European cure for tapeworm. Regarding such observations, Tewodros has stern question and a servant flogged to death. So yeah, they weren't on good terms. Okay, the British Empire ignored them for years. These appeals were ignored, and then we have this person writing a letter or making a book clowning him. No, that was mad disrespectful. Yeah, he was proud and he was impatient. This neglect was insult. So he demanded recognition not as the subject of an empire, but as an equal sovereign. So I got a question. What if they don't recognize you? So my thing is, so what if the world doesn't recognize you? You should recognize yourself. I wish somebody was in this corner and said, nah, bro, we good. My question is, do you recognize who you are? Do your people around you recognize you? That's our problem. We spend too much time trying to be recognized by others and we don't recognize ourselves. So when Britain failed to respond, he took increasingly drastic measures. In 1864, he detained several British missionaries who had been active in Ethiopia, believing that their presence might be leveraged to compel London to respond. His actions escalated tensions. The British viewed the imprisonment of the missionaries and officials as a diplomatic crisis. The letters from Ethiopian authorities were no longer ignored. They were treated as provocation. They were treated as if it was more like we're about to declare war. British public opinion, fueled by missionary accounts of the emperor's treatment of foreigners, began to push for action. In addition to this, he demanded for European assistance, not merely for technology, but the statement of sovereignty. By requesting sovereignty, he sought to bypass the influence of local nobles who had long resisted centralization. But ultimately, this dispute between him and Britain caused a clash of expectations. The British thought that he was just a good old boy and you hush your mouth up and you go into this corner. No, the emperor demanded respect and aid as an equal monarch, while Britain considered his demands and detention of their citizens as unacceptable. So this diplomatic stalemate set the stage for a war. This set the stage for Napier's expedition in 1868, which would culminate in the tragic Siege of Maqdala. Yeah. And of course, what happened to his son? Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. We'll get to that in a second. So now we have the Battle of Maqdala and the fall of the emperor. So by 1868, our emperor was a man besieged. His dream of uniting Ethiopia had collapsed under the weight of a rebellion, of famine, and betrayal. Many of his nobles he had once subdued, risen again, and the countryside was restless. Isolated and desperate, he retreated to his stronghold, the city of Maqdala. But Tewodros was not only cornered by his own people, but across the sea, the British government had resolved to act. They brought in, let me see what the book says. They brought in Egyptian soldiers. Yeah, to fight him. Yeah. Let me see if I can find it really quick. Yeah, they brought in people from Cameroon. They brought in everybody. Yeah. And so Queen Victoria's government authorized a massive expedition under the command of Sir Robert Napier. The British invasion was unlike anything Ethiopia had ever seen because nobody gives the middle finger to the Queen, right? An army of nearly 13,000 British and Indian troops, supported by 26,000 camp followers and 40,000 animals, advanced from the coast of the Red Sea deep into the Ethiopian highlands. They wanted him. They carried modern artillery, rifles, and even elephants that haul heavy guns over mountains, staggering demonstration of industrial power against a traditional empire. As Napier's army advanced, many Ethiopian chiefs hostile to the emperor either stood aside or they joined the British. So by the time the expedition reached Maqdala, the emperor was isolated. He was cornered with only a fraction of his mighty army. And on April 10th, 1868, the first clash erupted on the plains below Maqdala. Thousands of Ethiopian warriors, armed with muskets, spears, and swords, charged with fierce determination, but was crushed. The bravery of the Abyssinians, according to one author, was beyond dispute. Wave after wave rushed upon our squares, but they fell as grass before the sky. They was mowed down like grass. Within minutes, over 700 Ethiopians lay dead. Yeah. And 2 days later, the British opened their assault to the fortress itself. Cannons battered the gates. They battered the gates and they battered the gates. Engineers scaled the cliffs. Inside, Tewodros realized that the end has come. Refusing to surrender, he chose to die free. The British eyewitnesses later noted this. The emperor lay in the hut, his face calm in death, the pistol still beside him, the gift of the very queen against whom he had turned his wrath. Yeah. When the British entered Maqdala, when the British, let's see, you can see it. Yeah, when the British entered Maqdala, they found his body and buried him with honor. Yet, respect quickly turned to plunder. Missionary Henry Dofton observed priceless manuscripts. The labor centuries were seized and flung into sacks by soldiers eager for spoils. Maqdala burned, but its memory endured for Ethiopians. It became both a womb and a symbol. Okay, but now, here's the thing. What I've learned. This is what I learned. Okay, this is what I learned. What happened to his son? This is where it gets dark to me. Okay, what happened to his son? What happened to the prince Alemayehu, the emperor's son? Okay, get this. At the death of the emperor, Maqdala, it left Ethiopia without a unifying figure, but his lineage did not vanish. Among the emperor's children was Prince Alemayehu, a boy of just 7 years old at the time of the siege. After the fall of Maqdala, the British, seeing the young prince as both a political hostage and a symbol of the king's defiance, took him from Ethiopia, took this baby from Ethiopia. He was sent to Britain under the care of Queen Victoria to become his guardian. That's trash. He was basically a political prisoner and a hostage. While intended as protection and perhaps gesture of goodwill, the move also removed the prince from his homeland, his family, and his culture. In the UK, in Britain, the prince lived in royal households and attended prestigious schools, yet he was isolated. The boy was alone. As he grew up, he never fully adapted. He never adapted to European society. He was mostly withdrawn. He was sad and quietly. He was a proud person because his father was a king. You know, historians note that the prince became a living emblem of Ethiopia's struggle. Though young, he carried the weight of his father's ambition, the memory of Maqdala. The unfulfilled dream of a unified Ethiopia. Even in exile, he maintained Ethiopian customs, spoke Amharic, and preserved the sense of identity distinct from the Ethiopian world surrounding him. Unfortunately, he never was sent back home. He never went back home. He died in 1879 at 19 years old. He was buried in London. Yeah. But his story still lingers. There's been times where Ethiopia has requested that the son, Tewodros, to return, but they keep denying that. Now that is trash. That's terrible. That's terrible. This was his story. It became a cautionary tale of foreign intervention and fragility of dynastic continuity. The sacrifices that accompanied the pursuit of unity and sovereignty. We got to remember Ethiopia, even in its ups and downs. And this was a sad point. This was a sad moment where the child of a king was taken to a foreign land and died on foreign soil, never to return home. Yeah. So The reign of Tewodros lasted a little more than a decade, but his impact on Ethiopia was immense. He was a visionary who dreamed of unity, modernization, and strength, yet he was also flawed. He was a flawed man, prone to anger, whose heavy-handedness alienated allies. And in Ethiopian memory, the Emperor Tewodros was remembered as both a tragic hero and a ruthless ruler. He embodied the paradox of a man too far ahead of his time, caught in between tradition and modernity, between independence and encroaching empire. His struggle was not in vain, though. The dream of a strong, united Ethiopia lived on, carried by later emperors Johannes IV and Menelik II, which we'll talk about later. And Ethiopia, unlike so many nations of Africa, will resist colonialization, preserving its sovereignty into the modern era. There was so much more we could talk about, but this was the story of the rise of Tewodros II, Ethiopia's rebel emperor. If you want to learn more about Ethiopia, Kemet, and Kush, like and subscribe, right? And so today we was talking about the rise of Tewodros. This fell under Pillar 1, Ethiopia, the Source and Sanctuary. And here's some books: An African History of Africa. We're going to get into that this fall. This is by Zainab Badawi. And the Orthodox Church of Ethiopia, A History by John Benz. Check out A History of Ethiopia by Harold Marcus. That's a good one. The Ethiopian Borderlands by Richard Pankhurst. And this is our book. The affiliate links are in the description. Check them out. And this is my book, The Crusade, Jihad, and Jihad in East Africa by yours truly. Now, we talked about Kush and Kemet unearthing the Southern connection with Kemetic nation. Check that video out. And so we talked about the advent, the rise of Tewodros. And shout out to our members, Ujumbe members, Abina Scott, Brother Mo, and Brother Isu, One Voice Africa. I really appreciate you guys joining membership because they get all the details, the new things. And of course, membership has its privileges, right? So we talked about the rise of Tewodros II, the Disunity and Civil War, provincial rulers and foreign contacts, the beginnings of unification and legacy of Civil War, Tewodros and his reforms, his dispute with the British government, the Battle of Maqdala, and the loss of his son. All right? Now, if you like the content, share it with somebody that may enjoy it or share it on Facebook. So, yeah, we talked about the rise of Tewodros II, Ethiopia's rebel emperor. If you want to catch up with Ethiopia, the Source and Sanctuary, I got the playlist, or we got another video for you. Check it out. This is King Cam Ujumbe Podcast. Ujumbe means message, and I will talk to you later.